Hello, this webinar is titled The Pilgrims Story, a fast-paced overview, and I'm going to tell of their courage and faith in under 10 minutes, but I would invite you to explore all the video elements on this training channel about the Pilgrims, their faith, how they trusted God, and their principles for living. Let's get started. So we're going to use the diary of Pilgrim Governor William Bradford. This diary is remarkable. It covers 42 years of the Pilgrim story, 12 years prior to their voyage, the voyage itself, and 30 years of the colony. In the preface, he writes this: "My purpose is that their children may see with what difficulties their fathers had to wrestle in accomplishing the first beginnings, and how God ultimately brought them through." Well, what started it all? Bradford tells us. Martin Luther's work in Germany, John Calvin's work in France and Switzerland, and John Knox in Scotland began a process of Christianity being reformed. Reformed from the professional pulpits of the established church into the hands of the people. Martin Luther was the flashpoint for much of this. On October 31st, 1517, on Reformation Day, he nailed 95 points of debate to the Wittenberg door in Germany, where he felt like the church was in error and that they needed to discuss returning to the scriptures themselves. This is what was known as the Reformation. Well, from 1517 to that point to 1609, almost 100 years, this Reformation unfolded with much persecution. And out of that came a group of people called the Puritans, and their desire was to purify the church. And there was a second group called the Separatists that wanted to leave the church because they thought the church was beyond repair. And then there's a third group called the Pilgrims. They were actually separatists, but they felt so called to follow the scriptures as they understood them that they needed to leave their civil environment and find a new place to live out their religious freedom. These pilgrims were well-respected members of society, but their spiritual dedication made them willing to give up a tremendous amount of economic benefit in order to find their religious freedom. Well, they were persecuted in many ways in their faith. They lived in Scrooby, England, which was in northern England, but they felt it was needed to leave the British Isles and escape to Holland, Amsterdam specifically, where there was religious freedom. And so they went there and eventually, for almost 10 years, settled further out of Amsterdam in a place called Leyden. The public afflictions they endured for their faith made their cause famous and led many to inquire into it, and their Christian behavior left a deep impression on the minds of many. Some few shrank from these first conflicts, and no wonder, but many more came forward with fresh courage and animated the rest. So through their troubles and travails, they persevered in their Christian faith, and many others observers watched them with wonder. Well, on the way to Holland, a storm blew up. It was a 3-day passage to Holland, but it took 14 days to get there because of a storm in the North Sea. And when they arrived in the port, the Dutch people were astonished that the ship had actually made it, because hundreds of ships had been lost. Well, in Leyden, Holland, the Pilgrims had religious freedom. They lived there for 12 years. They were well-respected members of society, but they faced cultural challenges, but they also had latent in their souls a bigger vision. And that vision was to apply the scriptures to all of life, as individuals, families, as a church, and to civil society. This desire to apply these truths to all of life gave them a bigger vision of going to the New World to establish a colony there. So in July of 1620, they made their way to a port town, Southampton, England. On August 5th, 1620, they set sail for the New World. They were going in 2 ships, however, and one of the ships kept having leaking difficulties, so on September 6th, they finally decided to sail with just a single ship, the Mayflower, and they made their way across the North Atlantic. This is what was said at the departure. More than a few, not among them, argued that such an undertaking was open to inconceivable perils and dangers. It was replied that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties and must be both met and overcome with answerable courage. It was granted that the dangers were great but not desperate, the difficulties were many but not invincible. For many of the things feared might never befall them. Other problems, by provident care and the use of good means, might in a great measure be prevented. And all of them, through the help of God, by fortitude, patience, might either be borne or overcome. So this picture is of the Pilgrims on their departure as they headed across the North Atlantic. Well, another storm blew up and blew them off of their course from the Virginia colony to the Massachusetts area. Was this by providence or by coincidence? In Cape Cod, November 11, 1620, they landed. It took 66 days, a trip that normally would take 21. Well, they came ashore and they found no Native Americans, one of the only places on the East Coast that was not occupied. They found well-drained land. And this area had actually been occupied by Indians earlier, but the Indians had vacated the area because of illness and disease, and so no other Indians would settle there. So up and down the entire East Coast, of all the places that the Pilgrim journeyers could have landed, this one location was conducive and safe for them to arrive. Well, because their charter was for the Virginia colonies, and this area was outside of that jurisdiction, they needed to come up with their own governing civil document, and it's called the Mayflower Compact. And it says this: having undertaken this voyage for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of king and country, in the name of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together as a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, and for the furtherance of the ends aforesaid, meaning these 3 points at the top of the document. And then finally, in a summary fashion, the rest of the document goes on to say, with the power to enact laws, ordinances, and offices for the general benefit of the colony. The Mayflower Compact is absent from most high school textbooks. If it's even mentioned, most of this text is censored because of the fear of introducing God into public education and talking about the Christian heritage of the Pilgrims. And so it's no longer taught and censored from our high school textbooks. Well, the first year was tough. 50 people died in the first winter. 13 of 18 wives died. 2 or 3 people died a day. They buried the dead at night so that the neighboring Indians that they had not interacted with would not know their reduced strength. And the care of the ship's crew actually made a distinct impact on the crew, with many of the crew members putting their faith in God because of the Pilgrims' love and care for them during these troubled times. The next spring, a rather remarkable thing happened. A Native American that spoke English named Somerset walked into their midst and began to interact with them. He told of another Indian named Squanto that knew English better than he. Squanto's story is remarkable. He had been captured by Spanish traders and taken to Spain to be sold as a slave. He escaped and made his way to England. There he was taught the English language and got exposed to the Christian faith, and then was brought by an English captain back to this exact area just 6 months before the Pilgrims were to arrive. As he came into their midst, he began to be used as a special providence of God, William Bradford said. The cultural exchange between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims was a two-way exchange. The Native Americans showed the Pilgrims how to grow corn and other substance. The Pilgrims showed how to cultivate to increase the size of crops. Chief Massasoit was the chief of the neighboring tribe that Squanto was under. He became friends with the Pilgrims, and from that a peace treaty was signed the summer of 1621 that opened up the possibility to the first Thanksgiving celebration in that fall. By the fall of 1621, October of 1621, there was a reason to have Thanksgiving. Massasoit and 90 braves came with 5 deer and 12 wild turkeys, and the Thanksgiving celebration was had for God's deliverance and God's establishment of this Pilgrim colony in the coast of the Atlantic in America, and for these friendly relationships with the Indian braves, and God was thanked. The wonder of it all. It was to the astonishment of many and almost to the wonder of the world that from so small a beginning such great things could ensue, as in due time was manifested, and that there should be a resting place for so many of the Lord's people here when so sharp a scourge had come upon their own nation in England. But it was the Lord's doing, and it ought to be marvelous in His eyes. And so that's the Pilgrim story, including a touch point on the first Thanksgiving. Please explore these other webinars here on this channel for a more detailed look at the Pilgrims and their faith. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.